Tonight we'll be effectively covering the first 10 chapters of 2 Samuel. So we've finally made it to 2 Samuel. We've touched briefly on 2 Samuel at the end of Saul's life. We do see this transition period here, but we're right proper into 2 Samuel now, and we'll spend the next little while working our way through here. Tonight we're really focusing on David taking the throne, and David properly becoming king of Judah and then of Israel completely. And this is something that has been, promised from long before, and we've looked from in the last few weeks, both from Saul's side and from David's side, this sort of really difficult gestation, difficult pre-enthronement that David has, that Saul tries to kill him, that David has to flee, that David lives this very precarious life for some time. And you would think with Saul's passing that the way would be open to him, that he would be able to finally take the throne and to reign and to live a much more straightforward life as best as possible. But that's not how it plays out at all. And it's really interesting revisiting these scriptures, because I must admit, I mustn't be the very best of, I'm sure I'm not, biblical scholars, but in my head the transition was smoother. In my head I'd sort of neglected. And so again, it's the reason why we do these sort of in-depth, lengthy studies, looking at all this context, and in order to remind ourselves. And again, we sort of have these, the tentpole moments of David's life. We have him being anointed and not out in the field and not there with Jesse's other boys. And then we know David and Goliath, and we know that Saul goes after him, and then he sort of becomes king for a while, and then we have his problems with Bathsheba and all the rest. But actually this bit is just as problematic and just as difficult and just as bloodthirsty, I think, as many other parts of David's life. And so I've come to the conclusion that is probably not a dramatic conclusion at all to any biblical scholar worth their salt, but David has a hard life. David has a hard life his whole life. I don't think from my reading of what we have here, and obviously there are triumphs, and obviously God calls him a man after God's own heart, and God praises him, and God cherishes him, and God has a close relationship, one would say almost a fondness for him. And we see that reciprocated. We see David continually going to God, and in these scriptures seeking his guidance. Should I go up against the Philistines? Should I do this? Should I do that? We see that when he fights Goliath, and we see this in other battles and whatnot. Obviously, if we look at the Psalms, that's a whole other study and an insight into David's faithfulness, David's godliness, David's holiness. And yet the same man who has perhaps as close a relationship as any with God is this man who's constantly at war, both within and without. And again, I think before we get into the sort of meat of the study, we need to reflect, I think, on our own lives. And again, I don't think it's too big a conclusion to draw that faithfulness in God is not a direct equal sign to an easy life, or to a straightforward life, or to a problem-free life. And I know you know that. But David is one of the iconic figures of the Bible. There are huge chapters devoted to David. We know this, and if it's difficult for him, it's difficult. And in many ways, we'll look at Solomon in the concluding lessons to this series. And Solomon kind of establishes peace in the kingdom. And Solomon is rich beyond, all others and wise beyond all others. And yet it's Solomon who seems to have a much more problematic relationship with God, and a much more, certainly in the latter half of his life, it would seem distance from God, and a, a breaking of that closeness that we don't necessarily see in much of David's life. And so there's almost an inverse correlation there, that the ease of one's life, and again, Solomon reflects on this, that himself, that even though he has all of this wealth and ease and servants and you name it, that there's still this emptiness that's gnawing at him. There's still this vanity that's associated with things. And again, we'll go that in much depth. But as I said, in these 10 chapters here, I think we'll see David continuing to be beset by really great and challenging tribulations, even as he takes the throne, even as he ascends to what had been promised him, and even as some of his opponents are vanquished, others seem to rise, and as some, it's whack-a-mole, as some problems are resolved or addressed, others become acute. So chapter 1 we've looked at, as I said, at the end of Saul's life, and it's announced to David, and we see this, to use the vernacular, a young punk, someone trying to basically cry wolf, we might say, but in a way to that he can sort of inveigle himself with David and, become in his confidence and saying, oh, I killed Saul, and, surely that's, Saul was such an opponent of David that David would think that that's a good thing and that he should be proud of this man. But, of course, he isn't, and it's very likely that this fellow didn't kill Saul at all, but was either passing or in the vicinity, but didn't do that, and was just trying to be opportunistic. And for his troubles, like the boy who cried wolf, he's executed for even claiming to do that. Which again, we pointed out at the time, shows David's respect for the position of a king over Israel, even if he had little respect for the person who occupied that role. And we see David's very generous words in the latter half of 2 Samuel chapter 1, quite a beautiful lament, and in many ways a rose-tinted view of Samuel, and no doubt one that is coloured by his fondness for Jonathan and his great friendship for Jonathan. And of course Jonathan dies at the same moment that Saul does, and so no doubt David's remembrances are as much for his fallen friend as they were for Israel's first king. And so then David is anointed king in chapter 2, but he's not anointed king over all of Israel. He's anointed king over Judah. And of course, we remember, whether you remember or not, we have the record of the great split between Israel and Judah, the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes. And of course, this happens after Solomon's death, and Jeroboam and Rehoboam and all these sorts of things. This is before all of that. And it's important to remember that these things are kind of boiling away here already, that there is effectively civil war at the beginning of David's reign as well, tribe against tribe within Israel. And so the beginnings of the kingship, this way of governing that the people clamoured for and effectively rejected God for. Their first king ends up dead on the battlefield, a broken man. In the transfer of power, David is only able to reign over Judah in Hebron. Meanwhile, Saul's son is made king over Israel, Saul's son Ishbosheth. and he, in many ways, happens. And again, if you're familiar with medieval history, military history, even contemporary history. Sorry? Oh, raise my voice louder? Sure. If you're familiar with the ways in which palaces work, it's actually Abner. So Abner is the chief of Saul's army. He's the one who effectively makes Ishbosheth king, and maintaining that lineage to Saul, but he seems to be the puppet master or the kingmaker. And so this often is the way that the king is very much, or the leader, the ruler, is very much enmeshed in the military power, and a king that doesn't have the support of the military ruler is often a king that doesn't have long in that line. We see coups, and we've seen them throughout contemporary times. Coups very often coming from the head of the army or the head of the police, oftentimes, particularly in African states and South American states, although not exclusively. Certainly the Balkan states and the broken up Yugoslavia had similar sorts of things where it was the military ruler who assumes political or civil power as well. And so Abner doesn't himself make himself king, but he seems to be the one that is allowing Ishbosheth to do this and sort of enforcing this in some ways. We see likewise on the other side for David, Joab. He is his equivalent. He's David's, chief of the army, head of the army, and he likewise occupies quite a prominent role in David's reign. And so they go to war, and Joab and Abner basically go out in the field, and they say, "Young men, go at it, fight." And they do. And David and Joab's army wins, but not before we have this really interesting scene where one of Joab's brothers was fleet of foot. I think he's called as fast as a gazelle, and he as fleet of foot as a wild gazelle, and so he's pursuing Abner on the field of battle. And again, you can read the account yourselves, but basically Abner says, "I don't want to have to kill you, dude." And he says, "I'm not turning aside. Turn aside or get some armor, some protection." And he says, "I'm not going to do that." And so a familiar theme in these 10 chapters is people being stabbed. I warned you that it was bloodthirsty. And so Joab's brother, Asahel, he is killed on the battlefield by Abner. And Abner, doesn't want to do this. He kind of warns him, but nevertheless, it carries out. And there's this, I probably have said it about 100 verses, but 2 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 26, I think it's one of the most poignant verses in, I'm going to say all of Scripture. You can dispute if you like. I'm sure there's many others. But, these things that you don't sort of, again, it's not embroidered on a pillowcase. I suspect it hasn't been made in very many memory verses, but it's really powerful. And perhaps it should. He says, Abner calls out to Joab. Remember, these are the two, chiefs of their respective armies. He says, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that it will be bitter in the latter end? How long will it be, then, until you tell the people to return from pursuing their brethren?" Remember, this is Judah versus the rest of the tribes collectively known as Israel. How many generations could we write that? How many countries could say to one another, "Shall the sword devour forever?" I suspect you could pluck any generation from the entirety of human history, and that verse would be relevant. That someone could say with meaning, with context, shall the sword devour forever, including in our contemporary times, including wars that we've been involved in, wars that others, we seem to find them so easy to get into and so difficult to get out of. And again, wars, between states, but also, again, conflict between families, between, all sorts of different groups, all of the ethnic violence and things that we've seen. Shall the sword devour forever? Of course, it's a rhetorical question. Can't there be another way? Why do we have to kill brother against brother? And we see there, so Joab kind of agrees, and so he blows a trumpet, all the people come back, and they find that 19 of Joab's army plus Ashael were killed, and again, just lodge that. And then 300 odd, I think it is, 360 David's servants had struck down. And so then we come into chapter 3, and again, remember that, verse 26 that we just said. Verse 1 of chapter 3. Now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. Just, I don't know. It breaks my heart to read verses like that, to see, these are the people of God, and it shouldn't matter, but especially so, like just how much they had been taught, how much examples they had had, all of these sorts of things that you would think should have some influence, some bearing, some moral weight that would cause people to stop and to think and to go, oh, is this what God wants? Is this how we should be behaving? And yet it seems the need for blood vengeance, for whatever it might be. And remember, it was formerly Saul who was in the ascendant and pursued, David and his supporters, and now it's foot, shoe on the other foot. And so David's house grows stronger, Saul's house grows weaker. And so we see, again, remember we said that Abner was the one that was really strengthening Ishbosheth and his reign, the one almost allowing it in a way. And then, so you'd think Ishbosheth would know better, but Ishbosheth makes a claim about Abner, that he had taken up one of Saul's concubines, one of his mistresses, I suppose we would say. And Abner takes great offense at this. He's really, offended. And again, it doesn't actually say, people can take great offense and still be guilty of the offense. It can be a misdirection, or it could be that this was not true at all. And it's probably more likely that it wasn't true, but whatever the point, this is a fatal decision by Ishbosheth, because it was Abner that was effectively allowing him to stay with the power that he did have, and he's just ticked off the strongest card that he has to play. And Abner is so incensed by this that he says, right, that's it, you're done. The kingdom is now David's. I'm going to make an alliance with David, basically, and give it to him. Revenge much? This is one of the great themes, and one that we want to bring out, this idea of these, internecine politics and relationships, the ways in which people are fighting each other and betraying each other and avenging each other and just at each other continually. And so Ishbosheth becomes very afraid of Abner. And Abner goes to David and says, basically, let's make peace. Look, you have been promised all of Israel. Now is the moment. Now you should become king of all Israel. And David agrees to this. Meanwhile, Joab had been out fighting because that's what they did at this time, particularly if you're the chief of the army. And he comes back and he does not trust Abner. David trusts Abner. David mentions several occasions in this section here in the latter part of chapter 3 that Abner was told to go in peace and that all was good and all was right. And it seems that Abner does have some degree of respect and certainly some degree of wily, knowing how to make things work and where power should lie. And again, we've seen sort of characters like this in sitting behind the English throne and politics and these sorts of things. So Abner seems a very wily and perhaps wise, or that sort of streetwise character. Nevertheless, Joab comes back and he says, "No, I don't think we should be trusting this guy. I think he's just doing the old double cross, wanting to get in his good graces in order to spy him out, in order to undermine or assassinate David." And so remember, Joab has skin in the game here. Joab's brother was killed by Abner. So not only were Joab and Abner, rivals on the battlefield, but it's personal. And we're told that it's personal. So Joab basically doesn't tell David his plans, but he says, "Go and get Abner back. We need to talk to him." And so Abner comes back. Abner at this stage thinks all is good. He's made things right with David. David has the ultimate authority, but Joab kills him. And we're told that Joab kills him to avenge his brother. Not even to protect the throne, not even out of some preemptive strike because he thinks David. This is blood vengeance. This is family vengeance. This is revenge from his own. And David is not in favor of this at all, did not approve of this. And David says, "I am not guilty of this." Again, I think he can understand that Abner clearly exerts a level of influence here. And he says, "This is on Joab's head. This is on Joab's family's head." And he doesn't remove Joab from his position, but he certainly effectively curses Joab. And he says, in all of Joab's family lineage, there will be somebody who has a hemorrhage or who has lame in some way, who's going to be permanently disabled or ill. Fun times, eh? And so all because of Joab's revenge over Abner first killing his brother, all of these things playing out. And so we come to chapter 4, and chapter 4 doesn't get any rosier. We continue to see these things playing out back and forth. And so we're introduced here to Mephibosheth, and so we'll come back to Mephibosheth, but in verse 4 we're told about Mephibosheth, and that he is lame because when they were fleeing, that this is a son of Jonathan, and that when he's fleeing that they basically fell and his feet were crushed or injured and he became lame. And then we're told about these two characters, Rechab and Baanah. And again, remember back and we looked at this again briefly when we looked at the death of Saul. But in chapter 1, we had that fellow saying, I killed Saul. and David not taking too kindly to him. Well, here we have two fellows who actually do kill Saul's successor, Ishbosheth, and they, remember I said, stabbed him in the belly, dominant theme, but then they also need evidence that they've done what they've done. So they cut off his head and bring his head to David and say, look, this is a good thing, right? You were an enemy of Saul, the house of David and the house of Saul. These are enemies. We've killed Ishbosheth. That's a good thing, right? And David says, no. I killed the guy who claimed he killed Saul, and I'm pretty sure he didn't. You guys actually did this, not under my authority, not under anything like this. No. So these two fellows are put to death and executed as well. So we get to chapter 5 of 2 Samuel. Remember, it was only partway through 1 Samuel that David was promised the throne. 2 Samuel chapter 5. Finally, all the tribes of Israel come to David, saying, indeed, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and brought them in. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd, my people Israel, and be ruler over Israel. Therefore all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. So obviously David is a significant character in the life of Israel. And here we see him finally king over unified Israel. And so the first thing that he does is take Jerusalem. And again, we sort of think Jerusalem is always associated. And I think Daniel's done a number of studies. I think we did a study individually on Jerusalem, and today Jerusalem is perhaps one of the most contested bits of geography in all the world, but it was not always certainly Israel's capital and most prominent city. It takes on its significance effectively from here. It's called the city of David. But beforehand, there were other tribes that occupied the space. But it's here, 2 Samuel chapter 5 and verse 6, that the city is taken and becomes what we know to be, the Jerusalem of significance, the Jerusalem of New Testament writings, the Jerusalem of the early church, the Jerusalem of today. And that's a very condensed version of a much more complicated history, I'm sure you understand. And so then we see him making alliances and people paying tribute. So David's kind of, and Israel, they accumulate, some power. David is a good warrior, and he has a good army, and it's a strong army. And if you're a neighboring area, you either get slaughtered on the battlefield or you pay tribute. You basically form an alliance, and we see at other times Israel, in time of Judges and in different times, and then in later times as well, them being kind of on the receiving end and them having to pay tribute to other kings, or again, having their people taken away as slaves for empires that are not Israel. But Israel is about the strongest, regionally, politically, in its whole lifetime, kind of in the reign of David, around this time. And so we see the likes of Tyre forming an alliance. It's been a little while since we've had the Philistines, and so the Philistines come back into the picture in 2 Samuel chapter 5 and verse 17. Whenever they seem to go up against David, very often it doesn't go well. We're told there that the Lord has broken, verse 20, the Lord has broken through my enemies before me like a breakthrough of water. And so it does not go well for the Philistines. And then chapter 6, we sort of, we have these big, battles and whatnot, and then we have these sort of small moments. And here we have remember, so Jerusalem is now being established as the capital, and so of course we need to bring in Jerusalem as the house of worship as well. So the ark is being brought up, and this is the famous account of the oxen stumbling and a poor fellow putting his hands up to stop it, but it is not to be touched. And it seems awfully unfair for this fellow's life to be taken. But, again, it's difficult to draw universal laws and things like this, but, God takes holiness seriously. God takes the boundaries that he draws seriously. We can learn from this. We can learn in the New Testament as well, where we see, right at the beginning of the church, people dying because they did not respect the church and did not respect the integrity of the church and think they can lie or treat it in ways that are not becoming. And so, fair or not fair, the reality is it's serious, and we must likewise respect the seriousness of what God says. And you can argue the point if you like, but it doesn't really end up very good for those who like to argue the point, does it? And so we have David rejoicing in this kind of bittersweet moment. So you might remember Michal from 1 Samuel. Michal was Saul's daughter who was betrothed to David. David had asked for her hand. Meanwhile, David went off and married other people, and again asked Daniel for the politics and all of the theological understandings of multiple wives in the Old Testament. We won't go down that rabbit hole certainly tonight. But so Michal and Saul tried to use David's attraction to Michal as a bait to try to get him to go out and kill the Philistines and be killed by the Philistines in order to win her hand. But David's really good at fighting, and so he gets 100 of their foreskins, it says. Anyway, so he's still betrothed to Michal, and he says one of the conditions when Abner comes to make peace with David, one of the conditions was he says, well, I want Michal back. I want her to come back with. In the meantime, she got married to somebody else. And we have this scene where Abner, again, this kind of cunning fox Abner, he says, right, well, that's happening. Michal, you're back there. The poor husband's like weeping afterwards saying, wait, no, what about me? And Abner says, go away. And he has to go away. When powerful people speak like this is what happens. Not a great basis for a marriage, one would suspect. And here we see it playing out. We have this small window, David dancing over the ark sort of being brought back, and Michal basically saying, you're a fool. You made a fool of yourself. And David saying, no, I will rejoice even more, in celebration of God. Basically, Michal is embittered at how she has been treated, and I suspect probably with some justification, but again, just these little throwaway lines. Verse 23, therefore Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. And just a throwaway line, and then kind of Michal's parked to the side for a while, but again, quietly devastating. This woman, basically a pawn in the games that men play. Not for the first time, I suspect not for the last time. Again, I don't think the Bible is necessarily, endorsing this or saying, this is how these things should play out, how it should be treated. It's describing what happened, and I think it's a terribly sad thing. So then we have chapter 7, which is a really significant chapter in sort of the wider understanding of this great scope and arc of Scripture and how it all links together. I mean, while it's really interesting to look at some of these individual battles and Abner and Joab and these sorts of things, chapter 7 is the thing that links back into Hebrews, and it's the thing that links back to Abraham and joins a lot of these things together and articulates with the likes of Isaiah and other things. So probably deserves its own study in its own right. To be honest, I think Daniel's study on Hebrews is probably almost a better place for that. But so our time is running away, so I won't go into all of that. Effectively, there are promises that God makes to David concerning the wider scope of his lineage, and again how to interpret prophecy and God's promises. People of Jewish persuasion today would point to these verses and say, see, Jerusalem is ours and should always be ours. See, Israel is ours and will always be ours, and God will protect us, and that's why we should have this land. Those of the Christian persuasion would suggest that actually he's talking here much more about Christ and how Christ comes through David's lineage, how it swaps over from Saul. Look at Matthew 1 and these sorts of things. Again, we can spend a lot of time, but then, so the first half of that chapter is this promise that is made, the often referred to as the Davidic covenant. Obviously, God makes covenants with the likes of Adam, with the likes of Abraham. Well, this is another one of those significant covenants that are made. And as I said, perhaps we'll study it in depth a little later. And then the last half of the chapter is David praising God for this covenant, thanking him. Chapter 8, we have some more battles, and you would not want to be Syria on the wrong side of David, because we're told that, a big part of chapter 8, that where are the verses? Yeah, David took from him 1,000 chariots, 700 horsemen, and 20,000 foot soldiers. We see several other, there's at least 2 other occasions where many thousand, I think on one occasion 40,000 people from Syria are killed, and that was because they'd come to help Amnon, I think it was. And so basically, again, lots of bloodshed, lots of military battles in which David and Joab leading those are successful. And God clearly allowing them to do so. Again, really bloodthirsty times. And as I said, this seems to be the lot of David. This seems to be that even when he is, obviously strong and in God's favor, he is still at war. Even when he's united the throne, he's still at war. And then we have this lovely moment in chapter 9 where, and this is where I want to sort of conclude, where David asks in verse 1 of chapter 9, is there still anyone who is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? And remember a few chapters ago we looked at Mephibosheth, who was sort of briefly popped up, and then we went over to Ishbosheth's murder. Well, Mephibosheth kind of spotlight comes back on him. And Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, and had been rescued by his carer. And David honors Mephibosheth. And David says, you will eat at the king's table, basically now. So he's given a place of high honor. And then, as I said, chapter 10, more battles, more killing of Syrians, all sorts of things. Remember at the start, remember what we looked at. Remember Abner killing Joab's brother. Joab coming back and killing Abner. Abner getting ticked off because Ishbosheth insulted him, and then basically taking his throne away and giving it to David. All of these revenge plays, all of this, the house of David and the house of Saul literally at war. And yet here we have an alternative. Here we have, and I understand that Jonathan's involved here as well, but David could adopt the position, well, Saul's family should be wiped out. There should be no lineage whatsoever, no threat to me, no callback to Ishbosheth, to Saul, whatever. Let's just wipe him off the face of the earth. He doesn't do this. He wants to show him kindness. And I think it's a really interesting principle that as we conclude our study tonight, that revenge, bitterness, hatred, hurt, all these things we can hold on to. And we can do it maybe with some justification. And we can take it out on other people. And we see here clear examples of people doing this. And what good coming of it? Shall the sword go forever? When do we stop? When do we do something else? When do we try something different? Here we see, and again, I'm not, saying David gets it right all the times or whatever else like this, but in this moment, I think we see something different, some moment of grace to transcend rather than the sword. And I think it's worthy of reflection in amongst all of this bloodshed and difficulty and palace intrigue. So we'll finish our class there. Thanks very much for those online.